So Robert has accidentally led the convoy, or part of it, onto this dike, and it's slowly collapsing. So Robert has to think quickly and turn around the situation. So he saves the horses, the supplies, and the men who are stuck on this slowly collapsing dike. And keep in mind, he's surrounded by fog. All around him would be these pools of water, and he can hear noises. There's some birds he can hear, and then there's these pools of water that are sort of filled with this goopy mud, and that's where this picture, I'm sort of trying to emphasize the fact that there are these sort of sinkholes full of muddy water, and as he describes, they could pull you in, and you could almost drown, or you can drown if you went through the earth. And this is what happens to Robert. So he is trying to lead the men out, and he goes first because he's the one in charge. And then almost instantly he steps away from the dike and then sinks, and he has to sort of struggle to get free. And then there's this sort of a near-death moment for him. When he is supposed to be a leader. So this is another instance where the ideal image of being a leader and a leader of men falls apart, right? His plan had fallen apart, and now here he is almost dying. And then the description is sort of one of panic. So we've seen Robert go through these moments of panic before, when he was trying to shoot the horse, or even the sexual panic that he experienced at the brothel. But this is another moment when he is close to death, and but he's able to overcome it. But the description is very sort of there's lots of imagery, and all around him is death. So he's hearing all the slap, slap, slap of noise, but it's the fog, and then there's this mud pulling him down, and it's also blinding him. So there's chlorine gas stuck in the mud. So it's just toxic sludge, and it's everywhere, and he can't get out. And then there are birds around him, so he hears these crows in the distance, and he sees another body next to him. He doesn't know this is a dead body, but eventually he comes to recognize, once the fog lifts, that the whole field was full of floating shapes. So men who have also died being drowned in these sinkholes. And the only sounds of feeding and of wings. So these crows are everywhere in these pools, feeding on the dead bodies that are there. So floating shapes could be horses, could be men, but again, they're just bodies floating everywhere, and then birds feeding on them. So birds are another, if you're looking at depictions of animals in the book, birds are another one that pop up regularly. And they seem to be most associated with death in the novel, so instances of death are also punctuated with the presence of birds. So crows are kind of like vultures, I guess, in the scene, that are feeding off the dead. They're carrion eaters, so they eat the bodies of the dead. And they are an indication of death. So you think of a big black crow is also somewhat, symbolic of death being everywhere around you. So Robert hasn't drowned like the other men. He actually is able to pull himself free. And again, gets the convoy back in order. But this is the sort of first instance where we get a depiction of the life and death circumstances that are everywhere, not just, bullets flying, mortars blasting, but even the physical landscape has become toxic and can kill a man through this mud and toxic gas. So Robert makes it to the front lines along with Levitt, and he's in charge of his section. So it says on page 81, each man I guess each lieutenant would have a charge of a section, 75 men and 95 horses. So Robert will go through, because he's a leader, he'll have, a section to be responsible for. So if you're a leader, you again are responsible for the lives of your soldiers. And there's a description of the dugouts where the men spend much of their time when they're not in midst of the battlefield. So these dugouts would be sort of temporary housing places where you could sort of relax for a moment before you go into the trenches and try to advance on the enemy. So they were sort of the home for the soldiers who were on the front line. So we learn more about all of the soldiers who Robert shares his dugout with. We've already met Levitt, right? He is the very practical-minded, very sort of serious and sort of strictly, he wants a sort of systematic, orderly kind of war. So we learn a little bit more about him. So on page 89, there's a description of Levitt. Oh, and he's known for his books. So each man is kind of associated with a symbolic item, so you can make note of these in the wiki pages as well. So Levitt sat at the table reading. When he read, he put on spectacles that made him look old. He was a strange man, Robert decided. Eager to be of help and resourceful in his way, he was also a cold man to whom it seemed nothing much existed outside of his mind. He had come back all that way alone with the trumpet to save Robert's life and Poole's, but what he was doing was merely practical. It had nothing to do with courage or a lack of it. He was the sort of man who, when asked who was there, said me. What else, or who else might there be? So Levitt, very practical. Levitt also carries this book of Clausewitz. He's always reading, and he doesn't do things for courage, but mostly just because he's a very sort of in his mind kind of person, right? He's all about books and the theory behind war, but he's not a soldier in the sense that he's ready for violence, right? He's studied war, he's read books on it, he's preparing himself in the most sort of intellectual way possible, very rational and practical, but he ends up, surrounded by chaos, which is going to disturb his sort of worldview. His view of the war will also become sort of shattered when he experiences the realities of how chaotic and how death was everywhere. So it couldn't be played out in a very strategic way that he had in mind. And then we also meet some of the other guys. Devlin is introduced on page 84. There are Devlin and Bonnycastle. So two men. Devlin is described as tall, frail man with a drooping mustache and a slightly receding hairline, despite the fact he was only 27. He tended to carry his head thrown back, which gave him a first glance a superior look that might have indicated snobbishness or grandeur. But Devlin was possessed of neither of those traits, anything but. He was as gentle as a lamb and wanted to own a shop and sell antiques. And Devlin is the one who has that panel of stained glass, and he's collected stained glass from various sort of abandoned churches, and he's trying to hold on to them. He also has a plaster statues. There was a kneeling angel made of plaster and a pair of plaster sheep, no doubt from a creche. And then Devlin announces the fact. He says that the fact is I'm devoted to fragility. Glass has a certain fineness and brittleness that a man with my bones appreciates. So he is somebody who is described, he doesn't seem like the typical macho soldier type. He's as gentle as a lamb, frail, tall, and he is delicate, right? He has these delicate pieces of artwork that he wants to preserve, um, and it kind of seems irrational that he would have stained glass in a dugout, right, where there's bombs going off. So these fragile pieces, trying to maintain them. And then we have Rodwell, who is, one of my favorite characters. He's the one who is very much, he's sort of similar to Robert in the fact that he has a bond with animals, and it's revealed that he is a children's book illustrator. So he has a notebook, a drawing pad where he depicts illustrations of animals. And then he has this whole sort of menagerie of wounded animals in cages that he keeps near his bed. So he's got birds, rabbits, hedgehogs, toads, and things. It's kind of his makeshift animal hospital. And so he catches these injured animals and then helps them recuperate and then hopes to let them free at a later time. And Rodwell sort of looks kind of grumpy, and Robert associates him with the toad that he keeps, this wounded toad. So Rodwell is kind of like a toad, but he is actually very sort of kind and sensitive, and he sees something in Robert as well, this bond, this affinity with animals, or Robert is kind of like more like an animal himself. And Rodwell's an illustrator of children's books, and he has a daughter back home. So he's an interesting character as well. Not your typical soldier, or what you would have in mind as this, that macho tough type, right? This is a man who is sensitive and compassionate and caring for those who are wounded. So all of these friends that Robert makes, they are all somewhat like him in a way. They're all men who are caught up in this horrible, destructive event, but they're all individuals, right? So Findley makes the point of introducing each one by name, giving them specific characteristics, showing us that they're fully fledged individuals. They're not dehumanized tools. They're not just a soldier, a nameless soldier who dies. Each man has a personality and a character, and there's sort of this idea that he's emphasizing the human qualities of each man, which is important in contrast to how the military system just deploys all these men without considering their personalities, the fact that they're individuals, and again dehumanizes them. So each man is introduced, and Robert has a kind of epiphany. On page 90, he says, Robert looked along at Captain Rodwell. He too was strange. We're all strange, Robert thought. Everyone is strange in a war, I guess. Ordinary is a myth. Robert was feeding the toad. They were two of a kind. So each soldier has these sort of unique traits, unique quirks that make them strange. But he also is saying that everybody is strange in war, right? It's something about the circumstances, being surrounded by death all around you. It kind of changes and emphasizes those human qualities that we all have, and makes you bond with everybody too. So there's a sort of closeness or intimacy and friendship that develops between people when you are surrounded by death. So Findley is definitely doing something in his development of Robert alongside these other soldiers who all sort of share something in common. So they're each sort of a unique individual, just like Robert is. But we only have Robert's sort of story being told. So in your wiki pages, you guys can make note of each of those characters, the men. It'll help you keep them straight in your mind. And then I also want you to look at what happens to each of those characters, what's their fate in the war.